Hi guys, this is Jeanette. We're going to talk today about going over this worksheet for organizing information from your ETR case study into some nice bulleted points that you can use to write your IEP present level. So you'll have to bear with me. I recorded this once earlier and realized that the voiceover didn't save. So I'm going through this again. I went ahead and left all of my information filled in here just for the sake of time so that you don't have to wait around for me to type everything in. But I did just want to walk you through this example of Sherry's ETR case study. So you can find Sherry's ETR on Moodle. But I just wanted to walk through specifically for her the social, emotional, and behavior piece. We've talked a little bit more at length about the academic achievement sections in class over the semester, but I wanted to give a little bit more attention to the social, emotional, and behavior piece. Much of what we do in regard to that will parlay and will help you with the academic achievement present levels, but I wanted to focus specifically here in this example on the social emotional side. So the first thing that I would recommend that you do is just start at the beginning of your ETR where it talks about the child's background history. There will typically be some information included from the parent, information about like vision, hearing, and health information. All of these sections provide great insight into just an overview of the child, looking at their strengths and weaknesses. If there's a student who already receives intervention services, this will outline for you what those look like and where they receive those interventions, whether they're in regular or special classes for the different content areas. So definitely read over these sections very carefully. And these sections provide a lot of information that you will need to compose the cover page of your ETR in terms of other information that's relevant to pass that field trip test we reviewed in class. So you'll want to just kind of highlight any relevant custody information that's discussed, behavior needs that the child has, behavior plans that the child might utilize, health, medical, safety information. Just remember you want to include on that cover page of the ETR in that large box down at the bottom left-hand corner, kind of underneath the demographic information, anything that would be relevant for someone to know about the child that's unfamiliar with them. Like if they were taking the child on a field trip, if you had a substitute in your classroom, just information that's relevant that might be discussed at greater length in other areas of the IEP, but that you would want to give just a bulleted snapshot for on that cover page. Remember, this is not a place to write a paragraph or write a novel. We're looking for bulleted bits of really important information on that front page. So the background history and these first introductory paragraphs of the ETR will be where you get that information. So definitely refer to those sections, get familiar with the child and pick up those facts that you want to include on the cover page. Also go through and just fill out this basic information section at the top of the table in regard to interpreting the achievement tests. You're going to want to walk through the ETR, just put regular things here like the student's name, and then just get your bearings on what the ETR contains in terms of what assessments were given and what each of those measure. So for instance, we have Sherry here. This is her name. And I just made a couple of notes that I got from her ETR that she's a 7th grade student in her disability category as other health impaired minor. So you're just going to pull out any notes or anything that's relevant that you want to remember or kind of highlight from the ETR. So looking at the different tests that are given, I would recommend that you pull out the name of the IQ test, the name of the achievement test, and the name of any social, emotional, or behavior rating scales. In this particular case with Sherry, she did have 2 different social emotional rating scales, so I've listed them both here. Remember, if you get confused about what a test measures or which one is the IQ test, maybe it's a version that we haven't talked specifically about in class, remember to look for words for the IQ test like intelligence, cognitive, intellectual ability. Those all mean the same thing, and those are all talking about the cognitive area. So also it should say specifically that it's an intelligence test or a cognitive test somewhere in the name of the test or in the description of it. So here there were two different cognitive tests reported for Sherry, and because we don't write goals for cognitive test scores, remember we wouldn't write a goal for that area. We just use what we know about the student's IQ or cognitive ability to help us as educators know what the child's profile is for learning, to know their relative strengths and their relative needs, and help us teach and support them the most effectively. So because we're not writing a goal about the cognitive results, I'm just going to kind of gloss over these areas, and I'm not going to get super specific when I pull this information out to my table. So this overall or full scale IQ, remember, is like a general measure of her ability, and that's low average. She has low average verbal skills, average nonverbal or performance skills. Down here in this other IQ test, she's got average working memory on that, low average processing speed. So I just wrote here that she had some Wechsler IQ scales that were administered in her evaluation, and she had a low average to average IQ or intellectual ability. So that's what I chose to write down from her IQ test results. Looking at the name of the academic achievement test that was given, she did receive a test for the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement. So this is the area or the test that looked at the areas of reading, math, and writing for Sherry. So I would, just kind of read the description of that. This was just a record review, so it's fairly brief, but usually the description of the test would be a little bit more lengthy. But anyway, I would just kind of note that the achievement test, and you might want to write reading, math, or writing if you just need that reminder. You might even want to remind yourself here in regard to the IQ that you're not going to write a goal. So you might just make yourself a note, no goal for this area. But the achievement test is going to look at reading, math, and writing skills. In our case, this addresses the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement. And some notes that I pulled out of Sherry's ETR, or that it was done by a private psychologist. It was administered in 2013, and that the records were reviewed for this ETR. So not that you have to write that in your present level or anything, but that was just some information I wanted to remember and put in context about these scores. So kind of backtracking in this particular ETR, the social emotional scales were listed before the IQ and the achievement test. So I noted that the one assessment that was given was called the brief, or the behavior rating inventory of executive function. If you're confused about what something measures or what kind of skills it's evaluating, definitely go down here and read the first paragraph. This should tell you specifically what the test is for and what it measures. The second paragraph will usually discuss the child's scores and the skills that they have strengths or needs in. And then the final paragraph will typically talk about the implications for those skills deficits on their education. So this is where we're going to refer to pull out some of that information that we need to write our present level, but that's just generally how all of these paragraphs will be organized, that they will talk about the test itself and what it measures. So if you're ever confused about what it's measuring or what you're looking at, definitely read that first paragraph. The second paragraph, again, will review the skills that the child has and how they scored on that assessment. And then the last paragraph will usually discuss the implications for those skills or those scores on the child's performance in the classroom or their need for intervention. So definitely keep that in mind as you process things and and work through this table. In terms of the brief scale, I noted that it's an executive function scale. Some of the things it addresses would include organization, impulsivity, attention, emotional regulation, Same thing down here for the Basque. So that's reflected here at the bottom of this page. And the same thing holds true as far as the way that the write-up is organized. It talks about what the Basque measures, how the child performed, and then implications for Sherry in the curriculum. So I just noted that the Basque was another social emotional skill that was given. It addresses social emotional and behavior skills and listed some of the skills that are addressed. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. This just kind of helps you organize the information, make sure you know that you have all the information that you need and that you understand what type of test each test is in terms of the skills that it measures and the areas that it addresses. So moving on to the results of the reading test, we're going to go back to, I guess it's down this way, looking at the results of the academic achievement evaluation. So we're talking about the Woodcock-Johnson test. And I just listed all the tests that have to do with reading here in my table, followed by all the tests that have to do with math. For your ETR IEP case study project, you're just going to be writing a goal, one goal for reading and one goal for math. So in our case, you don't need to worry about writing for this assessment. So I just organized those so that you can kind of look at the skills cohesively and look for patterns in the children's achievement. So here I have the broad reading score written down all the way through the letter and word recognition, the passage comprehension, and the reading fluency subtest. Definitely refer to those achievement subtest description charts that I posted earlier in the semester. They will talk to you a little bit more specifically about what skills are measured by each subtest. So if you have questions about that, also, I know you haven't worked with or given the Woodcock-Johnson specifically, but all of this subtests are relatively the same in terms of the way that they measure skills. So having given the KTEA and the Wyatt, you'll definitely have a good idea of what this looks like and what skills are measured. We also didn't get a percentile rank reported in this particular ETR. We just have standard scores and a description. So that's okay. You won't always get all of the information to fill in the entire chart, but just fill it in with what you have. So I used the descriptions that were provided here in the ETR to fill in, the description. So whether the child is average, low average, wherever they fall on that normal curve. So this just helps us organize and understand the reading subtests as well as the math subtests and look for patterns. As I kind of eyeball Sherry's performance here, a couple of things that I notice are that she's in the low average to average range in regards to her overall reading skills, her word recognition skills, her comprehension skills, but she has a real weakness with reading fluency. As we move down to the math subtest, similarly, she's got low average skills with calculation, average skills here in this version of calculation. And again, we don't really need to get hung up on what's the difference between these or what do they mean. They're essentially in the average range. But then she's got a 74 in the area of math fluency. So remember that fluency adds the element of time constraints or a timed component to the skill, the academic skill. And I think it's interesting and just notable. I might highlight this or draw a star or something here just to remind myself that her skills in reading and math are all, hovering around the average range, but she does have this more significant weakness with fluency in both areas. So I just might want to take a look at that and just consider that as I'm prioritizing her needs. Looking at the social and emotional skills, one of the things that I would encourage you to consider is the fact that you can see here that the social emotional skills tend to provide a lot more information in a lot more areas than just reading, math, and writing does. So what I would encourage you to do here is certainly look over the results and consider them as a whole. but I tend to think it's easier to just record or write down or make note of the areas that are significant. So these index scores, again, I just kind of consider, but I really am not worried about writing them down. They don't tell me a lot. They're more of an average or an aggregate score. The subtest scores denoted here give me a lot more specific information about the child's skills. So I'm going to consider, but otherwise disregard these index scores. So like here and here, here's a composite score. Again, I'm going to consider those and just be aware of them. But as far as what I'm going to write down and put in my table, I'm just going to focus on the sub areas. And I'm just going to focus specifically on the ones that are significant. So I'm going to write down here that we're working on the brief test. And I just reminded myself that it's a T score and has a mean of 50. Again, that information should be included or referenced somewhere. On the table, you'll see it denotes that it's a T score. And down here in the description of the test, it will remind you what the T score mean and standard deviation is. So I just put that here as a notation in my table to further remind me of that as I'm interpreting things. And the scores that were significant that I want to really hone in on would be the scores of inhibit and shift. And also here it would be in working memory. So I have listed all of those skills here because they were significant, and those are things that we're likely going to need to consider in terms of intervention. So I've listed the T scores, I've listed the percentile rank, and the description. Okay, so I've gotten those all written down. At this point, don't worry too much about what does inhibit mean, what does shift mean. Just get down the T-score, the percentile rank, and the range, okay? And then remember what I had mentioned too about the way that these paragraphs are set up. This center paragraph will typically be where you will find information about what each of those skills mean. So here I might go and extend out another column here where I would just make a notation about what kinds of behaviors or specific skills would fall in each of these areas. I'm going to move on and do the same thing with the basque. I haven't gone through, the exact steps here just for the sake of time, but you would do it the same way in terms of looking at the sub skills and identifying any that are, at risk, like that are significant or that are just, kind of at risk, something that should be watched. So definitely read, excuse me, the narrative about the evaluation and the significance of each of the scores and use that to help isolate skills that you want to pull out here in your table for consideration when you write your present level. So here we have the acronym that we'll use to organize and prepare our present level. I've just focused on, again, the social emotional behavior area since we have spent a little bit more time talking about academics in class. I just wanted to highlight this, but you would really utilize the same process. So I typically, you can really jump around and start wherever you want. If you have a piece of information that jumps out to you, and there's a square that's easier for you to fill in than others, definitely start there and then work from that point. You by no means need to start here and work down the list. This grid here just really exists to make sure that you have something in each area so that you are sure to adequately address, all of the information that you need for your present level. So when I wrote this one, I found it easiest to start out with the quantitative information. So I went up here and looked at my table in regard to Sherry's scores on the brief. And I thought about how I wanted to prioritize the skills. So remember, if a student has a variety of needs or issues, we by no means should or need to address them all in one IEP. We would just prioritize the most significant or the most relevant need. And so I chose the area of working memory because I thought it might have some bearing on how she's doing with these fluency skills in reading and math. So I chose working memory to work on. So I went down here and I thought, okay, I know that the T score is 77 and the percentile rank for that is 98. and that it's a significant skill. So I came down here and I found it most comfortable to start with the quantitative square on this table. And I filled in that she has a T-score of 77 on the brief and working memory. From there, I came up here and talked about some qualitative information. This is where you're going to describe the student's struggles or their needs in words. So this is not where we're going to include um, numbers or facts or figures, but we're just going to talk about maybe the skills that the child struggles with. So I noted that she struggles with multi-step directions, completing steps, tasks with multiple steps, and staying on task. And from there, I jumped up here and thought about her needs. If she struggles with these skills, she needs to increase her skills for multiple step directions. She also needs to stay on task independently for greater lengths of time. So I kind of started here and then worked backwards. Also need to look at her strengths. For my strength, I referred back to the scale here of the brief, and I looked at some of the things where she was within normal limits, and maybe some things, if you have that information that's talked about here in the narrative. This particular one doesn't give a lot of information, but sometimes there will be more specific information about a strength. Also, if you happen to know the child personally and you know that they have a strength for following directions, if they're given an example first or if they're given a visual support. So if you have specific information about their strength in regard to that skill, absolutely, it's great to include that. But if you don't, use what you have. Either use information provided about the child's from the child's parent or from the child's teacher. It could be something as simple as the child has a really willing attitude for learning. They come to class prepared every day. They always have a smile on their face. They're helpful to others. So the strength can be, just in regard to the child's personality and work ethic. It could also be in regard to any improvement that they've made in their skills. Just keep it loosely relevant to the child's, demeanor or work ethic or the skill that you're talking about directly. You don't want it to be completely off in left field, but it also doesn't have to necessarily be directly related to the skill. It can be more about the child and who they are. Okay, so that kind of covers these boxes. Again, you can really land on the table wherever is most comfortable for you, wherever it's easiest. In this situation, I kind of gravitated toward the quantitative square because I had that T-score, and I just worked from there. So one of the things that you can talk about for the R acronym or the performance relative to peers would be their percentile rank. And here's just an example. I talked about her working memory deficits are more significant than 98% of other students her age or 98 out of 100 students. You could also talk about what a student that age or that grade level is expected to do or achieve, and then talk about this child's performance in relation to that expectation. So you can go about it, either way. I also wanted to talk about the last square here in the table, which talks about how their performance denies their access to the regular curriculum. Historically, this has been the area that students struggle with the most and tend to make the most errors on the project. I would really encourage you to just think logically and practically about this square. Don't overthink it and don't get, overly concerned or worried about it. Don't try to, really extrapolate too much information. Just think very logically about what skill the child is lacking. So in this case, we're talking about her present level of working memory skills. So keep that relevant to what you've been talking about. Don't switch gears here and start talking about her reading comprehension when you've always, throughout the entire present level, otherwise been talking about working memory. So just stick with the skill that you started to talk about, and then just say why it impacts her access to the regular curriculum. And just again, think logically and practically about a deficit in that skill, whatever it may be, and why that would make it difficult to do well in that grade level curriculum. So is it oral reading fluency and the child can't read as much material in the same amount of time as other children? Is it working memory and they're not as independent in completing multi-step tasks as other children? Is it conduct disorder and they are not able to establish and maintain relationships with peers or with teachers like everybody else? So just again, logically and practically consider how that skill deficit would make life difficult for that student or would make access in the regular curriculum a problem, and talk about that barrier. You can talk about interventions that the child might need in terms of the skills that they need to work on or be improved, but this would not be a place in the present level where we would talk about the student's eligibility for any particular service or placement. That will be a team decision that's made together with the IEP team, and it would be considered predetermination for you as the writer of the IEP to come out and say at this point that Sherry needs special education services to address her working memory or to teach her multi-step problem solving skills. We might say she would benefit from intervention of those skills, but remember, intervention can occur in a variety of settings and contexts, so that wouldn't be considered predetermining her placement. So just remember that the IEP team has the final say in placement and in eligibility. So you want to avoid making statements about those things here in this juncture for your IEP draft. So hopefully that helps you make sense of how to organize all of the information in your ETR. It helps you kind of get an idea of how to walk through this table and fill this in. Once you get this grid filled in with information in each area, it's really quite simple to go ahead and string it all together in a cohesive paragraph. Just keep in mind you want to write as professionally and as clearly as possible, and you also want to stick to your person first language. Thanks for listening and best of luck.